Welcome to Beyond the Pillion. This is episode 4, and today we are talking about buying a second-hand bike. My name is Kahiwa Sebire. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the chaotic one.
And my name is Mark Drechsler. I use he, him pronouns, and I put the ill in lane filtering. Yes, sorry, I had to get that one in.
Excellent.
We will start today also by acknowledging that we are recording this podcast on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people and to pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you very much. And today, used bikes. Kahiwa, what are we talking about with used bikes?
Yeah, we're building off a previous episode about buying your first bike, and today we'll be talking specifically about what to look for when you're buying a second-hand bike. I know for me, that was quite a scary proposition, particularly buying my first bike. Not a fan of buying used vehicles in general because it's something I don't actually know a lot about vehicles, and so I didn't know what to look for in order to make sure I was getting a good deal and not buying a lemon. So this is some of the information that we've built over the last few years and also in your work as well, Mark.
Yes, absolutely. Yep, it's a very common situation that I face where people come into the dealership. They are looking to keep their initial investment on a bike down to a minimum because they don't want to spend big dollars on their first bike because they're not really sure if they want to get into it full on. So they just want something that's relatively cheap. So I have these conversations at work a lot.
Yes, and to be clear, we are going to talk today about a little bit of difference between buying through a dealer versus private. And as we've mentioned earlier in previous episodes, there is no right or wrong answer here. There is not any one that is going to be better than any others. As with the idea of just riding in general, our advice is to kind of think about this as just a cost versus risk equation. As a general rule, you are going to pay a higher cost when you're buying from a dealer, but you're going to carry less risk when you buy from a dealer. Mark, did you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I see this a lot from the other side of the fence as well when we are buying secondhand bikes from people who want to sell them to a dealership, and they look at the bike and they look at what they think the bike is worth. And I have to have a conversation with them that a part of us buying the bike, even as a dealer, and same as you as individuals, is you're not really buying a motorbike, you are buying a risk. Now, that sounds a scary way of looking at it, but it helps. As Kay was said, everything is on a spectrum there. There's no right or wrong answer. There's no absolute zero risk. And there's not too many cases where you're buying 100%, unless you're buying something that is completely a burned out heap, then it is a sliding scale of risk. And I think the most important thing coming into this is understanding how much risk you're willing to take and being able to spot what those risks are. So just again, these are general rules, general observations. There are no guarantees in life other than what death and taxes is about it. Other than that, what we're trying to do here is to give you a bit of a model to think through what some of the risks are when you are spending your money, particularly on your first bike, but it works anytime you're buying anything, but particularly secondhand bikes. Sound fair, Kahima?
Yeah, and so I wondered, Mike, if you could talk us through what are some of the unique things about to keep in mind when you are buying a used bike through a dealer.
Yeah, so you are generally narrowing it down to either buying a bike from a dealer or buying it through the private market. Now, when you're buying from a dealer, I think Kahiwa introduced it, that generally you are buying a lower risk proposition. Now, something that comes in there is warranties. Now, warranties on second-hand motorbikes, there's a couple of things that come into play there. Whenever you buy a new motorcycle, you get what's called a factory warranty. So it's from the maker, like Yamaha, Kawasaki, Honda, whoever, that put a warranty onto their bikes. So that carries through for typically 1, 2, 3 years or thereabouts. Once that warranty has expired, then you are falling back to the whatever your local laws are around dealership obligations and laws for a warranty for second-hand bikes, and it does vary. You can get right into legal stuff about what is and what isn't covered. But just make sure you understand what your rights are, and don't assume that just because you're buying from a dealer, then you automatically have a full warranty on
Mm.
everything that you are buying. And the other thing though, when you're buying from a dealer is, so there's the legal side of warranties, but there is also in the very generally good days these days of social media and public reviews, as a dealer, absolutely go out and have a look at the reviews of the dealer that you are buying from. So not all dealers are created equal. People are brutally honest with their reviews on things like Google reviews, Facebook reviews, anywhere else that you might find online reviews. Go and have a read of them. Uh, yeah, take them as broad stats though. So also bear in mind, as the same with anything, you will get a small proportion of people that no matter how brilliant you are as a dealer, that will absolutely pan you no matter what you do, just because for whatever reason they see that you are not up to scratch. So look at them broadly, take them as something. Maybe if you see that there's a whole lot of really awful reviews, then same as if you were shopping on eBay, just take that into
Mm.
account and into that risk equation. Anything else I've forgotten on the dealer side there, Kay, or any of your experiences that you'd like to share?
I think the flip side of that is to think about why we would go to a dealer. And I know from my
Mm-hmm.
perspective, talking about that buying and selling of risk, I might go to a dealer because they've made a risk assessment when they purchase a bike or agree to sell a bike. That gives you a modicum of certainty or confidence that it's not going to be a complete lemon, depending on the reputation of the dealer, of course. That that can offer a bit more confidence as a purchaser that you're
Mm.
probably going to be in a safer place in terms of what you're buying. And
Spot on.
that can also be a really nice way to potentially connect in with places for services and servicing of the motorbike. And if you need any other consumables or other things alongside it, that can be a
Mm-hmm.
reason why we might want to buy through a dealer. On the flip side, they, as you said, they can cost a little bit more, but dealers have got to make
Yep.
some money. And so that's when you might want to look at buying through private, because usually it can be a little bit cheaper, is probably one of the main reasons. But Mark, what's been your experience about buying through private?
Yeah, it absolutely is the place where you are more likely to find a real bargain. But that risk equation, it is also the place where you can buy something that looks like a bargain that ends up being absolutely the an absolute train wreck of a thing, and you have zero recourse at all. At least with a dealer, even if there's no formal warranty, you can go out and make a lot of noise in public forums about what an awful dealer they are. If you're buying privately, then forget it. You have no recourse. So if you're going down that path, I suppose be aware you can grab some bargains. You're also carrying more risks, so it's very beneficial if you can get somebody who knows what they're talking about when it comes to motorbikes to come along and have and be there with you to have a bit of a look on your behalf. And later on, Kay will talk us through a checklist for
Mm.
things that you can look at that don't need a lot of technical know-how, but things that you can just have a look at and check as a potential buyer. And one other thing I want to mention, because this kind of segues into the bulk of what we'll talk about today, about that kind of checklist and that evaluation framework for used bikes. But when you are buying privately, always, always, always run a background check on the bike through whatever your local local government agency is that allows you to do a check on whether or not two main things. One, whether there is finance owing on the bike. Number two, has the bike been recorded as a write-off because it's been in a serious accident? And actually, three, I'll add another one in there, that the bike is not registered as being stolen. So in Australia, you can done that. You can do it for about $2 through a government-run website. Just do a search for PPSR, which is something securities register. But yeah, in most countries, you should be able to have access to an online register that will be able to tell you, because if you don't do that, and particularly if you then buy a bike and you find out that there is finance owing on that bike and the person who owned it before you has not paid their bills, then the bike can be taken by the finance company that owes money on it. When you're buying from a dealer, dealers will be doing all that as a part of their risk assessment before they bring a bike into stock. But if you're buying privately, just absolutely make sure you run the background check however you can to make sure that it has what's called a clear title. And I think
Mm.
those are the two main things for buying privately before we get into the checks here. Kahiwa, agree with that thought about having a list of checks?
Yes, absolutely. I think it can be really easy to get daunted and be a bit overwhelmed when you are buying a bike, particularly if it's buying a first bike or haven't had too much experience. Even just that difference of buying through a dealer or through the private market, that can start to feel a bit overwhelming. There's a lot of things to think about. There's a lot of risk. We're talking about managing risk. But so what we wanted to do is to put together a few basic things that you can check that don't necessarily require deep technical or mechanical knowledge. They're things that you can just have in the back of your mind to help weigh up and make a decision about, is this the right bike for you? Is this a level of risk that you're willing to take on? Because, of course, that question of risk and level, that's going to be different for everybody, as with everything else that we've shared so far. So we
Definitely.
want to share a bit of a list about things you can check on the bike whenever you might go to inspect it or have a look. And keep in mind that this might be relevant for some bikes and not for others, but generally speaking, these might be things you want to keep in mind. And
Absolutely.
Mark, you had a question here about the difference between kind of what you can see and what people might talk to you about.
Yeah. Um, Regardless of whether you are buying from a dealer or buying privately, just make sure that you keep in your mind the body of evidence before you, in terms of what you can see in the way of the actual bike itself or the documentation that goes with the bike versus what a person is telling you. And I say that
Mm.
regardless of who they are and who they're representing. But yeah, you can have someone who is standing there saying, yep, the bike has a full service history. It's like, well, okay, if it does, where are the records? Now, if they say there are none, then possibly the person is a mechanic themselves and they have been doing all of the work on it themselves and not keeping any receipts. I've got a couple of bikes like that in my collection, or one in particular in my collection that would fall into that category. But without that evidence, then you are very much taking the word of the person there. So again, it's just a thing. If someone is telling you something, but the evidence doesn't necessarily support that, then just add that into your mental checklist of risks that go along with the bike.
Mm-hmm.
So, as Kahiwa said, there is a list of things that you can have either written down or in the back of your mind, or however you want to do it when you do go and inspect a bike that you're thinking of buying, and for that matter, even before you get there, to sort of start assessing it from what you can see on the advertisements for it. And you don't need a huge amount of technical knowledge to be able to do it. Kahiwa, tell us some of the things.
Yeah, I think the first one that can be quite obvious, again, it's almost always listed if you're looking at online adverts, is how many kilometers has the bike
Mm,
done. This is one of
yep.
the biggest predictors of risk when you're buying secondhand. Ideally, in general, the lower the kilometers, the better, even if it might
Hmm.
mean that you're paying a little bit more. But going hand in hand with that is a history of services and servicing. But going hand in hand with that is a service history. And this is really important, that you make sure that you ask about the service history, and ideally, as Mark was talking about before, getting evidence that it has been done. The more kilometres a bike has done, the more risk there is. However, if it's been serviced regularly and appropriately in line with the manufacturer's guides, then that lowers the risk somewhat, because that kind of indicates that the previous owner or owners have really taken care of the bike, and that it's more likely to be in a good condition. And so when there's no service history, this just further increases the risk of the quality of the bike being a bit unknown. Mark, I think you get asked the question quite a bit about how many Ks is a lot. I know that's a question I often see
Yeah.
in online forums as well.
Yeah, for sure. People buying second-hand bikes, maybe they've bought cars second-hand before and they know a bit about that, and they say, well, how many kilometres is a lot of kilometres on the bike? So, firstly, just backing up what Kahiwa said, if a bike has a full service history, then you are hugely reducing the risks. Motorbike engines are small, that they're a lot smaller than a car. Particularly their oil tends to do a lot more work than what it does in a car, and an engine can deteriorate a lot faster than a car if it's not well looked after. In terms of how many Ks is too many Ks, in motorbike terms, you're sort of talking tens of thousands of kilometres when you are looking. So, yeah, for example, anything that has 100,000 kilometres, particularly if it's a learner-approved bike, 100,000 kilometres doesn't sound much on a car, but on a motorbike, unless it's a big capacity motorbike, which you won't be on to start with, then that is a very, very high number of kilometres. Ideally, if you were looking at a small learner-approved bike, like somewhere between 150 to 400 cc's, then ideally you'd be looking for something that's sort of less than 30,000 Ks. If it was anything more than that, then you would really want to be making sure that you have got a good solid service history with it. And any time you're getting up 40, 50, 60,000 beyond on anything like that, you are buying a bike that not only has a lot of wear on the engine, but is going to have a lot of wear on all of the other components. So when we're talking about bargains, you might find a bike that it looks like very cheap, and it's a $2,000 bike, but it's done 60,000 Ks, and then you can buy that bike and you can find very quickly that you can rack up another $2,000, $3,000 in work that needs to be done to it to get it up to spec. And then you're sitting there looking at it saying, oh yeah, maybe I just should have bought the more expensive one with no Ks on it. So yes, there's an answer to the question about kilometres.
And I think connecting in with that really closely is the service history, and that often motorbikes will have a particular set thing that needs to be done at a certain number of kilometres, and it can be really useful to just do a really quick search online for that particular model and the service history, or the service or order. What's
intervals.
The word for it?
Service schedule or service intervals. Servicing schedule is another one you'll find it under. Very good point.
And particularly in that between the bikes that we've looked at, anywhere between kind of 20 and 50,000 kilometres is often a significant service that gets scheduled. And so it can be a really useful thing to have a look at. Has this bike had, for example, if there's something scheduled at 50,000 Ks and it's done 55,000, has it had that big one done?
Yes.
Because that could be, a certain amount of money that you are going to need to spend as soon as you buy it. And that can be really useful as part of a conversation with a dealer. As someone who didn't check that when they bought their most recent used bike and then had to go back in and pay money.
Yeah, it's true. Asking all of those things, again, regardless of who you're buying from, understanding, is the bike coming up for service, and is that service one of the big ones, which if they haven't got the books with it, then you can research all that stuff online. And it is, some of those larger services can be, in Australian dollars, $1,000 service, if they are a proper big service where a whole bunch of different things need to be done. So as you say, Kahiwa, be aware. So what else have we got on the list?
Well, that leads us into the next point on there is ideally wanting to see the original keys and the original book. So the books will have
Mm.
the service schedule and should ideally have the service history to date. And
Mm-hmm.
the original keys, ideally kind of one and possibly a spare. And this can be
Mm-hmm.
useful because motorbike keys can be expensive to get cut, particularly some of the newer, more modern
Mm.
models where the keys are actually linked to a computer on the bike. Having the master key to be able to cut other bikes from is really, really, really useful
Mm.
in order to kind of get some spares.
Absolutely. And just to give an indication, building on that, if you have a bike that has a chip in the key which is matched to the computer that sits within the motorbike, and you lose all your keys and you don't have a master key, then worst case, you are up to replace the computer that runs the engine on the motorbike. To get that replaced as well as keys, you are going to be up for potentially a couple of thousand worth. So it is absolutely an important one to find out. Does the bike have keys that have security chips in them? And if they are, is the master key as a part of the deal?
Mm. The fourth thing that we think is really useful to keep in mind is thinking about modifications and spares or
Hmm.
original parts. So, in most cases, less is more when it comes to modifications.
Yes,
Having
please.
a whole eBay shopping cart of multicolored bling and shiny things
Uh,
doesn't necessarily make the bike more valuable, even though we know someone might have spent a significant amount of money on it. That doesn't necessarily equate to value when it's being sold, and it can actually make it a bit harder to sell. So if you are looking at a bike that does have a number of modifications, it's really important or really useful to check to see if the original parts come with the bike. And
mm,
if they don't, then it's worth asking the question if this means that the original parts might have been damaged, which can be a bit
mhm.
of an indication of the care and just the history of the bike itself. But take that with a grain of salt. You might never really know. Someone might have
Yep,
added things onto the bike and just not known that they should have kept the originals.
absolutely. And that comes back to that question of the evidence before you. If you
Mm.
see a bike that has a whole lot of things replaced, particularly on, and we'll talk about spots where bikes get easily damaged, but engine covers, levers, handlebars, any extremity of the bike that's been replaced by aftermarket gear. Could be because the person who owned it just really loves that anodized blue color of blingy stuff that you can put, or gold. I've seen some with gold. Lots and lots of gold on bikes. Some people just really love it. Other people, it's because if a bike has an accident, even if that's just falling off a side stand and does some damage to those bits, then often it can be cheaper to buy a $20 part on eBay compared to a $100 genuine part to replace it with. So it's not a definitive, but very much agree with Kahiwa that the closer you can keep a bike to original when it comes resale time, the better it is. And if not, then at least please, please box up all of your original bits, keep them in the shed, label them up clearly, and make it clear in your ad that everything is there available for the next buyer if they want to return it to an unmolested condition, as we call it.
Mm. Yep. That's definitely a pro tip if you are wanting to make modifications for your own bike. Yeah, keep all the original parts, keep them safe, and then you've got them to potentially sell with the bike if you go down that path later. But keep that in mind to as much as possible. It's useful to be able to see the originals if the bike has any modifications on it.
Mhm.
The next thing that we kind of bundled up a little bit are things like consumables. There are three things that can really add a fair bit of extra cost to the purchase of a new bike because they're often things that need to be replaced um, pretty regularly and they also naturally wear out over time. So they're not necessarily an indication that a bike hasn't been well cared for, but can potentially kind of connect into it. So the first of those is the tyres. It's really important to make sure that they still have tread left on them. technically shouldn't be riding a bike if the tread on a tire has worn down, but yeah, some people choose to live on the edge. But
Yeah,
as a
just
really
common
basic
sense.
thing,
Please don't.
yeah, as
Please
a as a
don't.
as a really basic thing, if the tires are bald or if there's a big flat line down the center, then they're going to need replacing.
Mm.
You can also check the age of the tires. There's little numbers on it as well. Yeah, wanting to,
Which we
yeah. Hmm?
might do that. I was just going to say maybe that'll be a video one we might do later about how to tell the codes on your tires to understand how
Hmm.
old they are. Mm.
Yeah,
Mm.
and so generally speaking, yeah, you kind of don't want to be riding around on a bike with tires that are 10, 12 years old. But regardless, if the tires are going to need replacing, that's potentially several $100s for a pair. So
Hmm.
that becomes an additional risk and should feed into the cost of the overall value of the bike that you're looking at.
Mm.
The second one, in terms of consumables, is looking at the chain and sprockets. Now, I don't know much about those. Mark, do you want to talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, yep. So, I mean, chain and sprockets are pretty much the same as if you had a push bike. There's one at the front which hooks up to the engine. There's one at the rear which is what connects it to the rear wheel and provides the drive from the engine to the rear wheel. And over time, they will wear out. Now, how long before they wear out is a real how long is a piece of string because it depends on how well the owner looks after them. And when we get into maintenance later on, you'll hear me reading you all out there and Kahiwa the Riot Act about looking after your chain in particular because you can destroy a chain in a few thousand kilometers and sprockets in a few thousand kilometers if you don't take care of it. So how do you spot chain and sprockets if they're worn? So the easiest way is just have a look at the general conditions. So if it's caked in crud, if it's dry, if it's looking rusty, if it's just caked in gunge and you can't actually see anything metal, if it looks loose enough that you can move it anything more than perhaps 3 centimeters up and down in the middle part of the chain where it sort of hangs down a little bit from the bottom, then you might want to get a second opinion to say, does that chain just need a damn good clean, or is that chain on the way out? And just another thing to note is it's very rare when that you just replace a chain. It's almost exclusively the case that when you do a chain, you will do a chain and both sprockets, because when one of them wears, they all tend to wear. So you will almost always replace them as a set because you're just asking for trouble if you don't. When you're looking at the rear sprocket, so very often you won't be able to see the front sprocket because it's tucked away behind a little cover. But the rear one on the back wheel of the bike, have a look at the shape of the teeth on that sprocket, assuming that they're not caked in gunge. If they're caked in gunge, okay, then you have a problem. If they're lovely and clean, but you have a look at them and they look asymmetrical, so rather than being a nice clean symmetrical U shape, it looks like one side of that U in each of the teeth is kind of worn away. Or if the teeth look the shape of shark fins rather than nice defined sprockets, then odds are that means that you are up for a replacement. And again, that's going to be a replacement of both sprockets and your chain, and you're going to be up for, to get that done by a workshop, you're going to be up for a few $100 to get that done. So that's chain and sprockets. We'll talk more about that later.
Chain and sprocket, tires, chain and sprockets, and
And
the
one.
last thing, the last kind of consumable there is looking at the brake disc. So, assuming that the bike is cold, so that you don't actually burn your fingers, then what you want to do is run your finger across the flat, shiny surfaces of the brake discs on both the front and the back. And what you're looking for is that they feel nice and smooth, and there's not much in the way of grooves. If you're familiar with ye olde records, we're looking for something that's not that. If it does feel like that, then that's a bit of an indicator that it hasn't been cared for. And so once again, that's a fair few $100s to replace potentially. And it's an indicator that overall, has this bike been kept in good condition, or is this one that may have been ridden and potentially not shown too much love, which increases
Mm.
the risk of the quality of the bike that you're buying. Now
Spot
that
on.
brings us to thinking about damage to the bike. So that was looking at
Yep.
consumables, things that we might be able to notice. But there are particular places where we can look for actual damage to the bike that can increase the risk. And we're looking ideally for the absence of that. They're
Mm.
not always easy to pick, are they, Mark?
No, they're not. As we hinted earlier, bikes that have been in accidents, if they're minor accidents, and a lot of motorbike accidents are very minor ones, then most of the bits that end up being damaged can be replaced, and sometimes it can be really difficult to spot when a bike has been down. And particularly for learner bikes. So here's a little tip for learners, and I'm thinking of one possible listener out there who had their bike for a couple of days before they had a mishap like this. Uh, you are almost certainly going to end up with your bike on its side
Mm-hmm.
at some point
Mm-hmm.
during your early learning experience. It happens to
Mm.
pretty much everyone, and it's good to get it out of the way early because at least then you will know what it's like and you can then know what to do, not to do it. Right, Kahiwa?
Yes.
Go on,
I think
tell us about yours.
my second bike, the R3. I was reversing it down a little bit of hill of the driveway, round the corner onto the other part of the driveway, and lo and behold, going too fast probably, and just didn't have control, and yeah, he tipped and crunched, I think, on the edge of the um, handlebars and also crunched one of the pegs, the foot pegs, I think.
Yes,
Um,
that's correct.
and a little bit of scritchy scratches on the end of the mirror as well. So
Correct.
that was embarrassing. Uh, took a took a little second to calm down, but I'm quite proud to say I got that bike up myself actually. Um, very very happy
Mm.
with that. But what you saw when we got the bike back up was some little scratches on the edges of the handlebar, replaced the foot peg, some little scratches on the mirror ends,
Hmm.
and those are pretty common places to have you know drops or maybe falls. I think is possibly a more accurate description for what happened there. Um, as opposed to something that might be a bit more serious. But all of these bits, they're pretty cheap to replace. And
Yeah.
generally speaking, if all you can see are little scratches or marks on things like the brake and the clutch levers, the mirrors, the bar ends, the foot pegs, the pedals, you probably don't need to worry too much about those. What you
Yeah.
want to keep an eye out for more serious things are things like damage to the fairings or the fuel
Hmm.
tanks, the engine casing, or to the frame as well, or marks that look longer across any of those things. They can be a bit more expensive to replace. Is the first part, but also they can indicate that the bike has been in a more serious collision or incident. Um, and this is often something that might cause a bike to be written off by an insurance
Mm.
company. So particularly damage to the frame. So just be careful if you see any damage to the frame. And I know we went looking at one bike and noticed they had different fairings on. We could see that
Hmm.
they were second hand or aftermarket fairings on the bike. I thought, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, they're nice looking fairings. They all look smooth. And then looked a little bit closer, saw some significant damage to the frame and a few other things, which started to indicate to us that actually possibly this bike had been in a pretty serious incident and they'd replaced the fairings in order to make it look good. But I think we ended up saying, yeah, no, thank you to that bike.
Yeah, thanks, but no thanks. And that was, as we keep coming back to risk management.
Mm.
And that's a great example of where possibly, even though that bike had potentially been in a larger accident, it might have been absolutely fine. But it
Yeah.
was looking at it and saying, that is carrying a risk because I really don't know how hard this thing was slid down the road or crashed into something. And there was a higher risk there that, yeah, this is going to end up having lots more problems. And yeah, damage to the frame and damage to the forks. Well, damage to the frame, as Kay was already said, that is the one thing that can, if you've got a frame that is bent, has had a significant impact, is deeply scratched or marked, little tiny nicks probably fine, but anything there where there's damage to the frame, as a rule of thumb, just walk away. It's just not worth the risk.
Hmm. So those are indicators of damage to the bike.
Hmm.
Things that are a little bit less serious and things that are a bit more serious that you want to keep an eye out for. And then there are things that are really just about the overall condition of the bike that will give you an indicator about how well it's
Mm.
being cared for and therefore kind of how much risk you're wearing in terms of the overall quality and standard of the bike. So a couple of the things, these are things that I'm probably a little bit better at spotting, but things like
Hmm.
rust, which by itself
Mm.
isn't necessarily a problem, but it can be an indicator where the bike has lived, possibly out in the rain. Or near kind of ocean or seawater, which can start to again kind of signal that maybe there are some other things kind of happening, or it might need some work in the future.
Mm.
The second thing, in terms of overall condition, is about, I suppose, just dirt. And you mentioned on looking at the chain and the sprockets, looking for mud or gunge or other things. If you're seeing dirt, and more than just kind of dust from riding it, but actual kind of dirt and
Mm.
mud and stuff, this indicates that potentially, just a general overall lack of care, which could then extend to things like servicing and maintenance, which if you're in a situation where there isn't the evidence of a service history, things like these might then start to say, I'm not sure if I'm actually going to believe this person potentially,
Mm.
and that they've actually done the service history. What are some of the
Hmm.
other overall condition things, Mark?
Uh, I think you've probably nailed a couple of the two most important ones. Another little telltale thing is looking to see if, as dumb as this is going to sound, are there spiders living in the bike? Are there cobwebs all tucked away inside the fairings? If there are, then it's usually indicative that the bike has not been used for a while and possibly just been, well, firstly, not cared for, and secondly, possibly sitting without being ridden. If you have a motorbike that hasn't been ridden for an extended period of time, the longer a bike's not ridden for, then potentially the more likelihood there is you're going to need a service, the potentially more little rubber fittings and bearings and hoses and things like that are going to harden up because they're not being regularly used. And yeah, you would want to factor that in. If there's spiders living in it, then probably a follow-up question is, when was the last time you rode the bike? And if they say,
Mm.
oh yeah, it hasn't, I haven't taken it out in 2 years, then okay, assume you'll be factoring in a full service for quite a few $100, because you will want to take that straight to a mechanic, whether you're doing it yourself or someone else, and changing probably all of the fluids in the thing if it's been sitting for a year or two, and really giving it a complete freshen up to make sure it's ready to rock and roll. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
it's also worth noting here that motorbikes, unlike cars, motorbikes aren't really designed to be left sitting outside in the elements for, through multiple winters, particularly if you are in areas anywhere near the ocean. So they're delicate little flowers, as a rule of thumb, and they are much more susceptible to just decaying really, really quickly if they've not been looked after. So the best bet is to buy your motorbike from an absolute clean freak who treats it like one of their children slash pets, and ideally lets it live inside the house. So if you can find one of those where you have somebody who is quite clearly fanatical about looking after their bike, then that is shows a level of commitment that is likely meaning that the bike is going to be very well cared for throughout its life, and on the whole, that reduces your risk in terms of the purchase. Reduces, not eliminates, but it's usually if it's been well cared for, and clearly has been nicely looked after, then yeah, generally that shows that people are that they care for their bike. And you would be stunned at the number of bikes that I see every day in my work that I look at them and I think, wow, why own a bike and let it be neglected as badly as you have when it's an asset worth, 5, 10, 15, $20,000 worth, and go out and have a look and the chain is completely rusty and almost dragging on the ground, and it's like anyway, I won't get ranty because I'll get ranty about maintenance in another podcast that we'll do later. But that's probably on the visuals of just checking over. And a lot of these things, as we've said, you don't need a huge amount of technical knowledge to be able to do those things. You just need a good, keen pair of eyes and to know what you should be looking for before you even get near starting the bike. And in starting the bike, Kahiwa, tips and tricks. You're there, you've had a look, everything looks like it should be okay. Now it's time to start it.
Yeah, the obvious thing, assuming you are buying a bike that you intend to ride, which maybe you're buying a bike for collecting purposes or similar, does it actually start? And does it run as you'd expect it to? So noting that different engines might sound a little bit different when they're at idle versus when they're kind of on the road or at higher revs. Ideally, it should sound healthy. It should sound good. This can be a time when, if you're not familiar with bikes too much, you might want to get a friend involved, just to kind of be there and give you another opinion about how well the engine is sounding when it starts. And if you don't have that, then that might be a sign to buy from a reputable dealer or a dealer that you trust, in order to reduce that risk. And if it does start, then often you probably want to be able to take it for a test ride. This can be pretty tricky as a brand new rider. So again, if you're just on your L's, your learner's permit, or haven't quite got there yet, you might want to bring a friend who can take the bike for a ride while you're kind of there talking to the current owner. And I found this really helpful when we're first buying my bike. I had my learner's permit, but I was still a little bit anxious on jumping on someone else's bike when I was new. If you were here for the previous episode, heard that I dropped the first bike I took on a test ride. So the second one we went out for, Mark took that for a test ride for me because I was very much nervous again. And I think when you do take things for a test ride, it's pretty normal for a seller to be hesitant, I think, to offer a test ride.
Absolutely.
Unless you are absolutely committed. I think, in my opinion, it should be the last thing. It's like, yes, everything else checks off my list. It's the kind of price point that I want. All of the other checks that we've talked about are met. I've got answers that mean, yep, I still want to purchase this. That test ride is probably best to think of it as the kind of final hurdle. Does it actually feel good when I'm on the bike? Does it sound and feel like the quality of bike that I've kind of understood based on all of the other questions? And I think when we took some bikes for a test ride, buying secondhand privately, left a license with one of the people, and because we went out as the two of us, had one person staying behind as well. So trying to also give the seller a little bit of certainty and security that we were trustworthy buyers, as well.
Yeah, it is, I think, very beneficial if you can take someone, even if they're not an expert in bikes, but at least somebody who is confident enough that they can jump on it, take it for a quick blocky, and at least be able to spot, does the thing vibrate to hell as soon as you go above 40 k's an hour? Does it have brakes that feel like they're working? Does it make any weird, scary sounds from the motor? You are still buying a risk. And if the person who's helping you doesn't get it completely right, I've had to do this once, to say to them, that's okay. I didn't expect you to be perfect, but at least you helped lower that risk threshold. So, yeah. But yeah, agree with everything you say. So takeaways then, Kahiwa.
Yeah, I think as you've probably heard, I think from our perspective, buying a secondhand bike is really just about risk management. That there's no right or wrong answer. There's no threshold of kilometers or age or whatever. It's all about just having a look, trying to understand as much as possible about the bike, and hopefully that checklist of a few things to keep an eye out for or to ask about will help you have a little bit more confidence trying to reduce the risk the next time you're going out to look at a bike, but also might just help you understand what are your personal thresholds. Am I willing to take on a bike without service history because I've got confidence around that, or I've got connections with a dealer or a really good mechanic and I'm confident that would be able to sort that out? Or I might be in a position where it's like, no, if there's no service history, that's a clear no from me because that's not a level of risk that I'm willing to wear. So hopefully with these kind of things to keep in mind, these questions to ask, these things to look for, be a little bit more confident going out and buying your next second-hand bike. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Mark?
No, I think you have absolutely nailed it on that one, which then I think leads us into next episode. So next episode, we are going to talk about riding to stay alive. So we hinted, I think, in maybe our first podcast that no doubt if you have got your license or thinking of getting your license, you will have heard the horror stories from people. You will hear them from well-meaning friends trying to make you realize what a dumb thing that you are doing in getting your motorbike license. So what we're going to talk about next time is the art, I think, the art and science possibly of riding to stay alive. So stay tuned, come back and have a listen for the next one. Kahiwa?
So until next time, we hope that you ride safe and have fun and come back soon. And this is Beyond the Pillion with your hosts Kahiwa Sebire and Mark Drechsler. Find us on Instagram and YouTube as Beyond the Pillion. Leave a comment to let us know what you'd like to know more about. And if you liked us, remember to rate, review and subscribe or share this episode with a friend. It really helps other people find the podcast.